Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to this week's edition of Advanced Bass Fishing, and really appreciate you guys stopping by, making some time to check it out. It's always grateful for that. Guys, today we're going to be talking about winter bass fishing techniques and tactics. We're going to have a deep dive into everything about winter fishing. I'm gonna have something for everybody, depending upon what part of the country you live in. Because I tell you one thing, guys, about winter fishing is good for the most of the time. If you gave me, say, Randy, what are your favorite times of year to fish as far as going out and catching fish? I would put spring number one, obviously. I would put winter the second behind summer and fall. I think late summer and fall are some of the toughest times of the year to catch fish. Actually summer and fall. Wintertime, it's just a really good time to catch them. And there's been a lot of myths broken in wintertime fishing since I started. Back when I started in the late 70s, most people think they just thought you couldn't hardly catch a fish in the winter. And if you did, you had to, all the magazines you read, you got to work a little hair jig on a 4-pound line or something. That's the only way you're going to catch a fish in the winter. That is not true, guys. Fish are a lot more aggressive in the wintertime than what people think. That's one of the things we're going to talk about today. But I'm pretty confident after this seminar, you're going to come away with it with enough skills to go out and catch some good fish in the wintertime if you don't have much experience doing that here. So what we're going to do is I've got about 8 or 9 different lures here. They're my favorite wintertime lures that work in a diversity of conditions. I'm going to go over each lure category, sort of tell you a little bit about them, how to fish them, maybe show you guys how to work them a little bit. And then in the second half of the seminar, we're going to talk about the areas that you need to fish in as far as the type of structures, the type of areas, water clarities, that type of stuff. So it's going to be a good little seminar here. I'm also, guys, sort of in return for all this 50 years of info, I'd just like to invite everybody, if you guys are needing to purchase any fishing tackle, to please use my tackle warehouse links. I'll put them in the description. And I'll put my generic tackle warehouse link along with all the links for the products I talk about, as well as our Fish the Moment Lake Map breakdowns, our virtual lessons, my solar pat sunglasses, and information if you want to book an on-the-water lesson with me. So much appreciated you guys supporting the channel through those avenues there. Okay, guys, we'll get right into this here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start talking about my favorites in the order of my favorites. So I'm going to talk sort of the bottom and then come up as far as the techniques that I like to use with it. So we get into that. So first of all, probably one of the top wintertime bass fishing lures that I do not like to fish that much is an Alabama rig. We're going to talk about that. Now, I do fish an Alabama rig, especially if I'm fishing for fun, because it is without a doubt one of the top winter lures out there, especially if you guys are fishing more towards not the far southern part of the country, but if you're fishing in parts of the country where the water temperatures stay, close to that 50-degree range throughout the wintertime, which is quite a bit now. It seems like the new norm is warmer winter temperatures with all of our changing climate stuff. So we have warmer winter temperatures than we used to. And an Alabama rig is just outstanding. Now, the first thing I want to say about an Alabama rig in the wintertime is the rig that you use is extremely critical as far as the size and the profile of the Alabama rig. Now, Alabama rigs come in a lot of different sizes. Some of them are big, giant, honking things. It's got the big 5 and 6 inch swim baits on it. But what you want, guys, is you want a small, downsized Alabama rig. This one right here is called, I think it's called the Desert Rig. I'm not sure. They use it out a lot west. But it's a small profile Alabama rig. Longest wire on it is probably, 6 inches long, 7 inches long. The rest of them are shorter, but it's designed to run with small swim baits like this Megabass Hazendong shad here. It's a finessey type of a deal. Now, this is a really good bait in the wintertime in a lot of different conditions as far as what you want to look for. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the conditions as far as to fish this Alabama rig, and then we'll talk a little bit about how I like to work it and everything. But one of the main important things, guys, is when you're fishing these finesse ones, don't use a swim bait that's over 3 inches long. My favorite, again, is this Megabass Hazendong shad. It's about 2.5 inches long. And the blades on an Alabama rig, one thing I found out about them is Alabama rigs that have blades on it work a little bit better in low light conditions. Say if you have a cloudy type of a day, and the ones that don't have blades on them work a little bit better on those bright days that don't have much wind. So if you have lower light intensity, go with the blades. But if you have brighter days, use the one that doesn't have the blade with it on there. Now, the thing that you want to look for on this is you got to have the right set of conditions for an Alabama rig to work. Now, you're going to find for the most part that an Alabama rig in the wintertime is a power fishing technique. And even though the water temperatures may be cold, you have to have the same type of conditions that dictate power fishing at other times of the year. This is one of those myths that you sort of break into. So when you're thinking of, when you go fishing, say you're going fishing in 2 or 3 weeks and you got a Saturday, go ahead and look at the weather forecast and look at the conditions you have. If you have a condition out there that you have some type of a southerly airflow and temperatures, like air temperatures that are pretty close to normal or above normal, and then you have some type of that airflow is going to be a little bit on the windy side, maybe at least 10-mile-an-hour winds. And if you've got some clouds thrown into the mix, that's an ideal situation for an Alabama rig in the wintertime, especially if that water temperature is right around 50 degrees. The combination of the 50-degree water, the low light levels from the cloud, and the wind, and the steady or dropping barometric pressure, it really makes the fish bite this thing really, really good. Now, if you get a day out there, say the front comes through, or it's a day out there where there's not much wind and it's clear water and bright skies, Alabama rig's probably not your best choice. But try to use the Alabama rig in the wintertime in those days that are conducive to power fishing there. Okay, the next one, there's 2 different lure categories we're going to talk about at one. One is is a blade bait, like this Mega Bass blade bait here, and the other is just an old jigging spoon here, just the typical jigging spoon blade bait. Now, these are obviously, they're designed to fish for vertical fish. Now, not that you can't do it, because you can cast these, and all you guys that are live scopers, this is probably some good techniques for you guys to fish. But for the most part, here's the way that I fish the blade bait and the jigging spoon in the wintertime. The thing that I like to look for on this is you got to have water clarities in a certain range. And that water clarity range, in order for a jigging spoon to work good, in my opinion, is you have to have water visibility between 4 and maybe 8 foot in visibility. If you've got water visibility less than 4 feet, I'm not saying you can't catch them on it, but it's a little bit more difficult. But that 4 to 8 foot range is going to be really good for both the blade bait and the spoon, because these are deep water lures and you're fishing for fish that are either on the bottom deep or suspended deep. And they can be either or depending upon the lake that you fish. If you have a lake that has really clear water, specifically a lake that has some type of a submerged timber in it, it's conducive to getting those fish to suspend over the top of it. Because, like, say for example, one of my favorite ways to fish these here on Table Rock Lake is I'll get out there in the middle of those creek channels where you have the tops of the submerged timber are 30 to 50 foot underwater, and I'll just pitch that spoon and that blade bait out in front of the boat and let it free spool and just jig it vertical on the top of those trees there. Or, if they're on the bottom, I'll get out there and do the same thing, like on a point. I'll just pitch it out there into the zone that I think the fish are, let the spoon hit the bottom and just pop it off the bottom 3 or 4 feet. But the spoon and the blade bait are traditional, old school wintertime lures. Guys have been fishing. I remember guys catching fish on a jigging spoon at Table Rock and Bull Shoals Lake back when I was in high school. This thing has been around forever, and it's really good when those water temperatures bottom out. So when those water temperatures get at their coldest point, that is when a jigging spoon works really good. And obviously you have to be on the fish for this to happen. If you're going to be fishing vertical for fish, you've got to be on top of the fish. And we'll get into that a little bit more as far as when we talk about the areas, because there are some tricks to get you pinpointed in right on the area of the jigging spoon where it works good there. I'll tell you one quick story about a jigging spoon. I was fishing a Bassmaster. It was my second tournament ever. It was on West Point Lake in 1986, I think it was. No, 1987, my second season on the Bassmaster circuit. And West Point Lake is in Georgia there. And there was 3 boats, and we drew out with other people, and then my partner took me to this spot, and there's 3 of us, no more than like 30 feet away from each other, jigging spoons on the end of this point. And one of the guys that was there caught a 30-pound bag and one that weighed 10 pounds right in front of me, and nobody else caught anything. So that's how specific in the wintertime they can get vertical as far as they get grouped up real tight. But jig and spoon, definitely a good technique there. Now the next one that works really good in the wintertime is just a jig. Just a jig and chunk, jig and plastic trailer. This is a really good wintertime bait in a lot of different conditions as far as water clarity and times of the year as far as in the wintertime. And the jig setup, it varies widely. It can be something from a full-size jig like this down to a finesse jig, but you can't discount fishing a jig in the wintertime. Now here's the thing that I like about jig fishing in the wintertime. Out of all the techniques that we're going to talk about here, fishing a jig in the wintertime is probably the easiest way to catch a wintertime bass. Because what you have to have and what works absolutely the best in the wintertime are steep, rocky banks, specifically bluffs if you have bluffs. One of my favorite, ways to fish a jig in the wintertime is to just cast it and pitch it up against a rocky bank, rocky bluffs, that type of stuff. Works really good, fishing it down anywhere between 5 to 20 foot deep. And one of the things that you'll find, and I don't want to get too much into the areas because we'll talk about that a little later in the seminar, but one of the things about a jig that you'll find out above any other lure that we talk about, it works in a wider range of water clarities and type of day than any other type of lure category out there. If you're fishing a jig in the wintertime, you can catch fish on a jig if you have 2 foot of visibility or 20 foot of visibility. It works any water clarity, and it works just as good on bright days or cloudy days or windy days or calm days. It's a really, really consistent way to catch bass if your bass are on the bottom and using rock. So that's another good thing on there. Now the next one a little bit, guys, we'll talk a little bit about some crankbaits. Crankbaits are an excellent wintertime lure, again, under the right situation here. Now the 2 different crankbaits that are my favorite is this Megabass Flap Slap. It's a flat-sided crankbait, and this is the old Lure Jensen Speed Trap. This Speed Trap, guys, is one of the top wintertime crankbaits that you can fish. And it looks like a square bill, but it's got a lot tighter wobble than a square bill. I don't know what it is about it. It's just the profile or something of the bait. But man, the fish in the wintertime love this thing. And usually what I'll do is I'll put some suspend strips on the bottom to get it where it doesn't float up very high. And then same with the Flap Slap, I'll put some suspend strips on it here. Now, if you're catching fish on a Flap Slap or a speed trap, either or is going to work a lot of times. Usually if they're biting a speed trap, they're biting a Flap Slap, although there is some variations. Now these 2 things here, in order for you to catch fish on crankbait in the wintertime, again, you have to have a specific set of situations. You have to have a lake that's set up where you do have some population of fish in some shallow water. For example, I'll use 2 different lakes here in my part of the country. If you went down to Table Rock Lake in the middle of January, Table Rock Lake's a clear water lake. Even though it has a lot of rock in it, it's got clear water, and these probably wouldn't work that good. You probably couldn't catch much on a crankbait in the wintertime at Table Rock. But if you went, 70 miles down the road to Grand Lake, where you have a little bit more dirty water and the fish live a little bit shallower, you can catch fish on crankbaits all winter down there. So a lot of it depends on how your lake is set up. So in order for the crankbaits to be productive in the wintertime, here's what you have to have. You either have to have some type of shallow grass in the lake you fish, you have to have water visibilities sort of in that 2 to 3 foot range, and you have to have fish that use a lot of rock, whether it be rocky banks, gravelly banks, riprap banks. It's all about rock or grass in the wintertime. Grass lakes in the wintertime are completely different than rock lake, because for the most part, what I've seen in grass lakes is you go to lakes like any of the TVA lakes, like Lake Gunnersville that have grass. Lake Gunnersville will get water temperatures into the 40s, which is a true wintertime temperature. Yet, when you have grass, it keeps the fish shallower and it keeps them more active. Bass that live in lakes that have grass on it will chase a lure a lot more than in lakes that have rock on it for whatever reason. There's something about the grass that makes the fish more aggressive in that cooler water. And that's why you can catch good fish like on a grass lake if the water temperature is in the 40s, like on a rattle trap or a speed trap or a flap slap, something like that. Just sort of, it's one of those things in bass fishing that's like you can't overanalyze. It is what it is. And that's sort of the way it is with grass fishing and crankbaits. But if you've got a lake, again, it doesn't have to have grass. If you've got a lake that's got rocky banks in it, any type of stuff like that, you can catch them on those crankbaits. I'll tell you a prime example of a great wintertime bite I got on one time. I was fishing Lake Wheeler Lake Wheeler in Alabama, and it was February. Water was cold. The water was like 43 degrees. It had a hard front come through there and it dropped the water. And guys, I almost won the tournament fishing a flat side crankbait. I finished 7th. It was a Bassmaster tournament on a speed trap and a little flat side crankbait, fishing any rock that I could. If it was a little rocky bluff, I'd fish it. If it was a little stretch of riprap between boat docks, if it was some riprap between barge ties, anywhere there was rock, they would bite that crankbait because there was a combination of that perfect water clarity, 2 to 3 feet, and a little bit of current. That's another element in the wintertime when you're talking about specifically crankbait and jig fishing. Current will keep those fish shallower. Now, say for example, if you guys are fishing like Logan Martin Lake in Alabama or Lay Lake in Alabama, you can go up that river in the middle of wintertime and catch them in 3 or 4 foot of water on a jig or a crankbait, with that moving water, because moving water will keep those fish shallower. One of the ways I figured this out, or that my earliest ways of figuring it, is back when I was in high school, before I got a boat. Me and my buddy, we had a 10-foot canoe, which was tippy as heck. You can't believe how tippy a 10-foot canoe is. And we would float these creeks down in southwest Missouri in the middle of the winter, and we'd catch a ton of fish in like 3 and 4 foot of water in those creeks in a jig. Water temperature had to be in the low 40s, so if you have current, it'll keep fish shallower in there. So crankbaits there. Now the next one we'll talk about here is we're going to get into a little bit more finessey stuff. We're going to get into the little swim bait deal. Now this is one of my favorite ways to catch winter bass all year long if you've got some clean water, and especially if you have a lake that has mixed species. This is a technique, guys, we'll talk about here. If you've got a lake that has spotted bass, largemouth and smallmouth bass, this is a really good way to catch them. And what I like to do, this is a mega bass, it's a 3-inch spark shad here, and I put it with the 1/8 ounce core tackle hover rig head here. You guys, you heard me talking about here, I'll show you this, the reason I like this hover head. Now the hover rig, you come in like 1/4 of an inch below the head like that, where you put it in, because the weight is internal inside of the bait. And I'll rig it here and I'll show you here. But you come through like that, and then you push the head of that through the end of the bait. So it's setting up like this. So I'll also put my tackle warehouse. These hover rigs are awesome, guys, but that's my little hover rig setup right there. I usually clip the weed guard off too, unless it's like, super snaggy, but you've got all that weight inside of the body of the swim bait there. It makes it look a lot more natural. But this little 3-inch swim bait, guys, it is freaking killer in the wintertime if you have clear water and a mixed species. It's probably ranks up there with a jerkbait as my favorite 2 wintertime lures based upon the condition. But the little swim bait, this is going to be the ultimate lure for you guys to fish in the winter if it's tough. Now, what I mean by tough, I'm talking about clear water, bright conditions, not much wind. When the fish are just hard to catch, you cannot beat a little bitty 3-inch swim bait like that. And again, we'll talk a little bit about where to fish it more in the seminar, but the main thing is you're fishing this for suspended fish and fish on the bottom both. You can pull fish off the bottom, you can catch suspended fish with them. It's a really good way to fish it. I usually fish it on 4 to 6 pound test line, and I'll go over how to work them here in the second part of the seminar, but I just wanted to briefly touch on that. Little 3-inch swim bait, the best. And finally, guys, as far as the lure categories go, before we get into the rest of the seminar, #1 lure for the wintertime fishing, you cannot debate it, you can't talk about it, is a jerkbait. The jerkbait is the #1 lure, and we'll be talking about this quite a bit. There's 3 different jerkbaits you have to fish in the wintertime. This is the Megabass 110+1, which is a deep lip version. This is the Megabass Vision 110, just the regular lip on it. And this is the Megabass X80, which is a finesse model. So you got to have all three of them. You got to have the regular size, you got to have the finesse model, and then you got to have the deeper lip model based upon the conditions. Now, for most situations out there in the wintertime, you can get by with the regular Megabass Vision 110 if those fish are sort of in that 6 to 7 foot range. Now, in order for them to be in that, in the wintertime, it's all about water clarity. If you have water clarity that's a little bit more, not super, super clear, like the water visibility in that 2.5 to 4 foot range, the regular Vision 110 is really hard to beat, because if you have water visibilities in that sort of that 2.5 to 4 foot range, that's going to put those fish in that zone where they're going to bite this bait that'll get down to 6 feet or so. Now, if you're in super clear water, like water visibilities of over 4 feet, that's when you have to have the deeper lip, because this bait's going to get you down pushing that 10-foot zone, which is going to be really critical in a little bit cleaner water. And then you got to have the finesse model, the X80, for those days that are super tough out there, because there's some situations where they do not want the bigger profile. You have to have a littler profile. And again, it's all about the conditions. If you have those days that are windy with low light conditions and temperatures aren't super cold, your larger jerk baits are going to be better, because the fish are going to be a little bit more aggressive, and the depth that your jerk bait goes is going to be dependent upon, again, your water clarity and your light levels. But then again, if you got those conditions where it's a little bit tougher, it's brighter, light intensities are higher, your wind's down, you've got to go to the finesse models. Now, you can't discount, guys. One of the things, if I could give you guys one piece of the wintertime advice for fishing, is the lure profile. The size of your lure on a jerk bait has everything to do with getting bites or not in the conditions. I've had so many days out there fishing where I could not get a bite on like the Vision 110 size, and I'd load the boat on the X80 size. It just depends upon the condition and the mood and the personality of the fish as far as the size goes. But guys, anyway, I'll go over this real quick here. This is my wintertime arsenal: Alabama rig, crankbait like a speed trap or a flat-sided crankbait, some type of a jig, some type of a spoon or a blade bait, and a jerk bait. Those are basically all you need. I don't care if you're fishing in Florida or in Ohio. These are going to catch fish all winter long. So take a little break, guys, and we're going to get back, and I'm going to show you, give you some sort of tips and advice on how to manipulate each one of these lures, because one of the things about it is if you don't work the lure right and you're not using the right equipment, you're not going to get the bites on it. So we'll go over the rod and reel and the line setup a little bit, and then in the last part of the seminar, we'll get into the areas you need to fish in. So I'll be right back. Okay, guys, we're back. Now we're going to get into exactly how you want to work the lure, as far as how you want to put action on it, how you want to manipulate it. And also I'll show you a little bit about the rod and reels and line setup I like to use it with them, because with anything out there, it's not that you can just throw the lure. You have to be able to generate the strike. And the strike generation and the landing the fish, all of that comes into play with how you manipulate the lure, the cadence that you put on it, the speed to retrieve, your hook set, your line, all that stuff plays a part. It's like a system. You got to have all of it coming together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the categories where you have to use a bait caster, and then we'll go to the categories you have to use a spinning. Now, talk a little bit about the Alabama rig first, guys. The Alabama rig, for the most part, I'm fishing on a bait cast rig, and I usually like to use on the finesse Alabama rig anywhere between 12 to 15 pound test Seaguar and VizX. Now, with an Alabama rig, you think that you have to use heavier line, but you don't, because this is the finesse rig, and these are little finesse swim baits on there, so you don't have to use much. So 12 to 15 pound test Seaguar and VizX. Now, what I do with it is I'll make the cast. Also with that, I'll fish it on this the Megabass Perfect Pitch or Roshi rod. It's a 7 foot 2 inch. I'd consider it sort of a medium heavy rod. You want a rod of at least 7 feet in order to throw the little A-rig on. Fairly stiff rod as well in order to cast it, because it does weigh a little bit. And also, guys, I'll put all my equipment links in the description here if you guys want to get some from Tackle Warehouse. But anyway, okay, throw your A-rig out there. Now, depending upon the depth of the water, you may have to let it sink a little bit. So my favorite way to fish it is I like to throw it to the bank and I immediately start my retrieve with my rod tip pointing at the bait. And I'm just a slow retrieve like that. And once I get it going, I'll try to follow it down the angle of the bank. So if the bank is fairly flat, I'm reeling at a little bit faster pace. If the bank drops off pretty fast, I'm reeling a little bit, and then I may stop reeling it, let it sink, and start reeling again. But here is the key to catching them on an A-rig, guys. You have to use the half turn method. So make the cast out there, begin your retrieve, and probably after every 5 or 6 cranks, speed it up like that. Just go a fast speed like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that. Speed that turn up for the half crank, and what it does is the A-rig will be coming through the water, and all of a sudden it'll just go like that, and then it'll start moving again, it'll go like that. That is so key in triggering the strikes, guys. If you, in a day's fishing, if I would just reel the A-rig straight in, if I catch 5 fish doing that, I can promise you'll catch 15 fish with the half turn on there. The half turn is what the A-rig is all about. And sometimes another way I fish it out there is I'll throw it out there, I'll reel it in there, and sometimes I'll pop it off like that. I'll just start reeling and just pop it up. And it's sort of the same effect. It's just reeling up there, and it jerks up like that and comes down. But try to make an erratic retrieve. It's sort of like with the crankbait. You don't want to just reel it in all the time. You want to always use some type of an erratic retrieve on the A-rig. Now the jig's pretty simple, guys. Jig deals, I'm just casting it out there. A lot of times, in most of the year, guys, I hop a jig pretty fast off the bottom. Not in the winter time. In the winter time, I'll throw it out there, let it hit the bottom, and I'm more just shaking it in one spot. And then I'll just pull it a little bit like that, and then let it drop down and just shake it in one spot. I don't want to move this jig real fast. I'm just sort of like working along the bottom, just sort of twitching it. I'm not popping it up off the bottom like I do in warmer months. So pretty simple, guys. You can't go wrong in the winter time just fishing a jig slow. Just shake it a little bit, pull it a little bit like that, shake it. Just don't pop it off the bottom real hard. It's pretty self-explanatory there. The next one that I use is the speed trap with a bait casting rod. And with the bait casting rod and the speed trap, I'm usually using 10-pound test Seaguar and VizX. On the jig, 15-pound test Seaguar and VizX, but 10-pound is my go-to line on there. Now, the thing about the speed trap in the wintertime is I'll throw it out there, keep the rod tip low to the water, and I'll just start reeling it like at a medium retrieve. And the same thing, guys, a half turn like that, just like with the A-rig. And sometimes after that half turn, I'll give it a half turn, and then I'll just pull it and reel it at the same time. So I'll cast out there, rod tip low, start reeling it, half turn, and pull it like that as I'm reeling it. And there's something about in the wintertime, and this also works with like a wiggle wort or something too, but when that crankbait's going down there like that, and then you half turn it, it speeds up, and then when you pull it, it sort of gives it a different action. It gives it a different action than when you're reeling. But when you're fishing crankbaits, remember that pull is sort of critical. I don't know what it is about it. It just gives the bait sort of a different look with it. So that's the situation with there. Now the blade baits, guys, also on this one, on the crankbait, I go to a little bit softer rod. I usually go to the Mega Bass Jerkbait Special. It's got a little bit softer tip on it. Forgot to mention that there. Jig, again, I'll fish it on the same rod that I do with the A-rig, which is the Mega Bass Perfect Pitch. And I'll also fish the next two that I'm going to talk about with the Perfect Pitch too, which are the spoon and the blade bait here. Spoon and the blade bait, guys, they both get fished on 15-pound test Seaguar and VizX. What I do with those, excuse me, I'm not casting the spoon or the blade bait, I'm pitching it in front of the boat. So my favorite way to do it is, say for example, I know where some fish are at. Say I'm on the end of a point or something like that, or I've seen a little rock pile out there. What I do is I usually just pitch the bait like 10 foot in front of the boat, and I let the boat sort of drift forward as I make the pitch, and I push the free spool, let it free spool all the way down until it hits the bottom. Once it hits the bottom, I'll just jerk it up like that, about 2 foot off the bottom. Jerk it up like that, about 2 foot off the bottom. 2 foot off the bottom. I'll usually do that for maybe, I don't know, 8 to 10 jerks. And if you don't catch a fish, jerking it up off the bottom at 8 to 10 jerks, reel it in, make another pitch, maybe 5 or 10 foot away, same thing. Free spool it down the bottom, let it hit the bottom, jerk it up off the bottom like that. Anywhere between 6 inches to 2 foot off the bottom. It just, you can't really go wrong with that. So that's the bait caster. Now the spinning outfit, guys, I fish all the spinning stuff I'm going to talk about here on the Megabass Whip Snake Levante, the jerk baits and the swim bait both. Show you a little, and the crankbait too, the flap stop crankbait. We'll show you, talk about the jerk baits first. We covered this a lot, guys, in the past, so some of you guys may have seen this before. But the way you want to work a jerk bait in the wintertime, to repeat myself if you haven't seen it, is you throw it out there, jerk it down about 10 times, slow like that, and then let it stop, and then just start vibrating your rod tip and barely turning the reel tip. Just barely turning the reel while you shake your rod like that. And then let it stop. Do that for maybe 5 turns, and once it stops, just pop it like that a couple times, and then let it stop, and then again, same thing, just start barely shaking it and reeling it. And what happens is, this is the way it looks. You're jerking it down to its depth, it gets down to the deepest part, and then you start vibrating it. And when it's vibrating, it's barely moving forward just like that for maybe a foot or 2 feet, and then you snap it and it goes, and it jerks like that. And then same thing, you start vibrating it, barely moves forward like that. That is the way that you want to work a wintertime jerkbait. You don't ever want to be, this is the worst thing you can do, is throwing it out there, jerk, jerk, pause, jerk, jerk, pause, jerk, jerk, pause. You don't want to do that. Learn the vibrating technique. And the best way to picture this, guys, is picture the jerkbait being down at its deepest point. And what you want to do is you want to keep it there, but you don't want it just to sit there. The whole concept of letting a jerkbait soak is overrated. It doesn't work that good. You want to keep that bait in the sweet spot or the deepest part of it as long as you can, but you always sort of want to keep it moving, even if it's barely. So I try to get it down here, and then by the vibrating it, I'm keeping it in one spot like that, and even the short twitches, it's like that, and then vibrating it until it starts coming up there. And if you've ever noticed minnows in the wintertime, they don't move around much. They don't just sit there and suspend, but they barely just move around. So that's what you sort of want to try to emulate with that jerkbait. Now the flap slap crankbait, guys, very similar to the flaps to the speed trap there, is I'll throw it out there, again on the Megabass Whip Snake, usually on 6 to 8 pound test Seagar and Vizex line. I'll throw it out there, I'll reel it down, to 8 or 10 cranks, and then I'll just start, maybe twitching it a little bit and pulling it. Reeling a little bit, twitching it a little bit, pulling it, maybe having a half turn. It's the same type of a deal. You want to get this crankbait down to its deepest depth. And that's what it's all about, guys. When you're talking about wintertime fishing lures, you're talking about manipulating and generating the action on the lure at its deepest point. When that bait comes down like this, and when it starts coming up, you're very seldom ever going to catch a fish here or here. You're always going to catch them down through the bottom here. So the flap slap or the flat-sided crankbait, when you get it down there, you want to sort of just like jerk it along a little bit and then reel it, pull it a little bit, jerk it a little bit, half crank, speed it up. You want to try to keep the action of the lure inconsistent, but you want to do it slow. And by twitching it like that, by having that bait down and twitching that crankbait, sort of like you do a jerk bait a little bit, that's how you keep it in a short length for a long time there. But you don't want to stop it, and you don't want it to be consistent. You want it to be erratic and slow moving through that water column there. And then finally, guys, we'll talk about the little swim bait with the core tackle hover head on it here. That's a very simple technique. Most of the time I'm just casting it out there. I'm letting it sink down to the zone where I think the fish are. And I'm usually keeping my rod tip, fairly low to the water, and just a slow reel like that. Just a slow reel. And then if I feel like the bait's coming up too high, I'll stop reeling, I'll let it fall back down into where I think the strike zone is, and just a slow reel like that. You don't really have to put any action on it because the paddle tail of the bait itself, you know, creates all the action there. And then, like I said, on a little swim bait, it is subtle, so you don't want it darting around a whole lot of times. So anyway, guys, that's how we work the baits. Take a little break, get a drink here, and we're gonna get back for the final segment of the video. We're gonna be talking about winter patterns, where you wanna fish these lures at, and what to look for on your lakes. So we'll be right back. Okay, guys, we're back for the final segment. And I don't know if you guys have ever tried to talk for like an hour like I've been doing here, but it'll wear you out trying to talk that long, just it's hard on your voice. So we'll try to get through this last segment here. Now, one thing's about the wintertime patterns, guys, it's like I said, it's not one lake fits all. So I'm gonna try to give everybody a little bit based upon the type of lake that you fish, and sort of some common denominators with that. So first thing that I want to reiterate before we get into this is that bass are more active in the wintertime than what you think. So one of the things that you'll find out there is a lot of times when you're fishing, say it's a real cold day and you're all bundled up, you think because you're cold that the fish are cold and they're going to be reacting the way that you feel, and you'll be fishing super slow. That's not the way it is really. And then there's other times where, say you get one of those really warm winter days where like it's 70 degrees in January, and you think because you're feeling good and it's warm, the fish are going to be active, and they're not. You can't equate your own level of comfort to the metabolism of the bass. But in general, they're a little bit more active all winter than what you think. So let's get into the what you want to look for in the wintertime, because there's really three different phases of the wintertime. You've got early winter, you've got midwinter, and you've got late winter, as far as the times of the year and the patterns and everything that they get into. And one of the things that you're going to have to remember about the techniques is it's real area specific and the time of the winter. So when we talk about early, mid, and late winter, we're talking about water temperatures relative to their coldest point. Now, midwinter would be like at the coldest point of winter, when it just is the coldest, when water temperatures have bottomed out. If you're fishing Sam Rayburn Lake in Texas, maybe your water temperatures bottom out at 52, 53 degrees. If you fish up here in my part of the country, maybe water temperatures bottom out at 37. Whatever that bottom temperature is, that is the midwinter point. And the early winter and late winter are the point of where the water temperatures are like 5 to 10 degrees, either on their way cooling down to the lowest point, which would be early winter, or 5 to 10 degrees above their coldest point, which would be in late winter, because fish react a little bit different in both of those. So anyway, what you want to look for is, let's talk a little bit about grass lakes first. Let's get them out of the way, because grass lakes, there are a lot of guys that fish grass lakes. If you have a lake that has grass in it, like I don't care if it's Florida or Texas or Alabama or whatever, consider yourself fortunate, because normally you have better winter fishing than a lot of people do, especially for quality fish. When you're fishing in the wintertime over grass lakes, you have to be out on those deeper grass flats, specifically somewhere either next to a channel or the deepest water. That's the big key with it there. And another thing about that is the density and the length that the grass is growing up off the bottom. That also has a factor in it. So what I like to find is the deepest water that I can that has grass growing off the bottom, at least a foot or so, a foot or 2 feet off the bottom. So if you're in a lake like Sam Rayburn Lake, you may find some grass flats out there in 7 to 9 foot of water that have grass growing 2 or 3 feet off the bottom with it, and you may have some adjacent ditches or deeper points. Those are ideal areas out there. Bass in the wintertime on grass lakes are going to be scattered for the most part, unless you have like some specific channel intersections or something to really congregate a school of fish. One of the things that you have to remember in grass lakes out there, it's all about finding where the fish are at in the big vast flats of grass. Now normally what happens is if you catch a bass, there's always more around. You may not be able to catch them without moving the boat, but for everything that I found out about grass flats in the wintertime is you may go through a long section without a bite, and then all of a sudden you catch one or two, and that whole area, like within 100 to 200 yards around there, will have a lot of fish in it. And usually it's because there's something different. It's like the grass is growing a little bit different length off the bottom. The density of the grass is a little bit different. There may be some mixed grasses in there. There may be some other cover present. But that's what you need to look for, guys, is those deeper grass flats in the wintertime adjacent to the deeper water. Now, for the man-made impoundments, like most of us fish, guys, it's completely different here because there's a lot of different ways that you can catch fish in the wintertime as far as where they're going to be at. And it's all relative to a couple different things. It's relative to the water clarity, and it's relative to the species of fish that you have in the lake as far as the mixture of species. For the most part, you're going to find out that your wintertime fishing is better on lakes that have some type of a diversity of species. The best winter lakes to fish are the ones that have an even distribution of largemouth, spotted bass, and smallmouth bass. A lake like Lake Cumberland in Kentucky would be a great example. Bull Shoals Lake in Arkansas would be a good example. Those are lakes that have mixed species and are really good winter lakes. The second best winter lakes are the lakes that have not the largest population, but a fairly large population of spotted bass in relationship to the other bass. They don't have to have predominant spots, but if you have a lake that has half spots and then half largemouth spotted bass, that is another really good winter lake. A good example of this would be like Lake Lanier in Georgia would be a prime example. Ozark Lake's again would be a prime example. Maybe some of the California lakes like Lake Oroville would be a prime example. Those are going to be really good winter lakes too, especially when you couple that up with different type of water clarities. Now, once you do identify that you have a good mix of species in there, or if you have just largemouth, that dictates your technique. If you have a lake that is steep versus flat, this is going to dictate technique because let's say, for example, you have a lake that's fairly flat, say like Lake Norman in North Carolina or Lake Murray, something like that, there's not a lot of steep hills and mountains and bluffs like that type of stuff. The fish on a Lake Norman or Lake Murray are going to be shallower in the wintertime than they will on a lake that's like a mountain type lake, like Lake Cumberland, Bull Shoals Lake, Lake North Fork, Lake of the Ozarks, something like that. If you have a vertical type of a lake that's mixed with clear water, a lot of times you're going to have more fish deep. But if you've got those flatter lakes that specifically has more gravel and clay on them, those fish are going to live shallower in the winter. That's why if you guys fish like, Lake Murray or Lake Hartwell or some of those, more flatter lakes like that, there's always usually a better crankbait bite. And the crankbait bite is always going to be better in those lakes where you have water visibility in that 2.5 to 3 foot range. That's going to be a really good place to fish them. And there's a larger population of fish with that. So one of the things you want to look for if you have a crankbait, if your lake's set up for crankbait fishing, is you have to look for steeper rock. The steeper rock can be in the major creeks, it can be in the main lake, wherever it's set up at. I prefer the major creeks. I would say that my number one type of structure for fishing a crankbait in the wintertime is to go back into the major creek arms, try to find the steepest banks within those creek arms and try to parallel those banks with those crankbaits like the flat sides or the speed traps in that type of water. It's a really good way to catch them. Another really good way to catch them in the wintertime on crankbaits, guys, is boat ramps. Boat ramps are a magnet. Don't ever pass up a boat ramp in the wintertime on a crankbait if you have water visibility of 2 to 3 feet. They will live on that thing because it may seem simple, but it's not, because if you look at the construction of boat ramps, it's not just a slab of concrete going into the water. You have a lot of times you'll have riprap on the sides of those ramps going in, and then at the bottom of the ramp, there's normally a little pothole that's been washed out where people have goosed their outboards to put it on the trailer. So there's a lot of structure on a boat ramp that's not seen by the naked eye. Crankbaits are a really good way to catch them. Also, crankbaits, you can't beat them over grass. All you guys that are fishing grass lakes, crankbait's probably the number one winter lure. Whatever crankbait you're using, it could be a lipless crankbait, it could be a something like the speed trap. It could be a deeper runner if your grass is deeper. Crankbaits are really good things under those conditions. And crankbaits will work the best for, seems like to me you can't catch many fish on a crankbait if that water temperature is anything past the mid 40s. You really need like a minimum of like 47, 48 degree water for that cranking to be good in the wintertime. And also another one I didn't mention is the wiggle wort. Wiggle wort crankbait can work really good in those same situations there too. Now for the spoons, the spoons and the little swim baits we talked about, guys, here's a situation where you got to have clear water. You're not going to catch many fish on a spoon or blade bait or a little swim bait unless you have clear water. And you can have a combination of fish too. Spoons and blade baits can be really good on lakes that have straight largemouth or a diversity species, so they work in a lot of different things, but you really need water visibility, in my opinion, of at least around 4 foot clarity for the little swim baits and the blade baits and the spoons to work good, simply because you're fishing deeper water and those fish aren't going to get that deep if the water's not that clear. Now, there's two different things that you want to look on as far as areas with the swim baits and little spoons and stuff like that. The only two areas that I pretty much fish are points and ditches. Favorite way to fish it, guys, is, like I said, getting back out there in those major creeks or the main lake. Get out there on those main lake points, the main points in the creek arms as well, and just graph them with your 2D sonar and try to find out where you see a lot of the activity. If you start seeing bait suspended, then start fishing suspended, like with that little swim bait out there on them. If you don't see much suspended and you see some fish maybe on the bottom or maybe some hard structure like rock and drop-offs on the bottom, drop that spoon and that blade bait all the way to the bottom. So typically what I do, I'll use an example of like Table Rock here. This is how I would approach it in the wintertime with that. I would get out off a point, didn't really matter the angle of the point. I'd get the boat in like, 30 to 50 foot of water, and I'd graph around and I'd try to find the drop off. And then once I was in 30 foot of water, I'd pitch that spoon and that blade bait into 30 foot of water and I'd fish a little bit in 30. If that didn't work, I'd move out to 40, 50 to 60. I'd fish that 30 to 60 foot range until I located the fish, just popping it off the bottom, fishing the point end and the point sides. That's a really good way to find them. A lot of times, guys, don't pass up a point if you can't see the fish, because a lot of times those fish will be tucked on the bottom in those Clearwater lakes and you simply can't see them. I've caught a ton of fish on a jig and spoon on points where I didn't see any activity on my depth finder other than the drop off and maybe some rock structure. So that's one good way to catch them. If you see fish suspended out there on those points, that's when you can throw the little swim bait and the hover rig head and catch them also as well. Now, ditches are in other places. Now, when we're talking about ditches, guys, we're talking about the middle of coves. So if you've got a Clearwater lake that has over 4 foot of visibility, go back in those coves off the major creek arms or coves off the main lake and start graphing in anywhere between 30 to 60 foot of water. And it's the same thing as the points. Look for activity. You're looking for bait, you're looking for shad schools, you're looking for structure like submerged timber, you're looking for fish. Try to focus on the depth zone where you see most of the activity. And it's the same thing with the ditches that is the points. I'll fish the spoon, I'll pitch that spoon into 60, 50, 40, 30 in the middle of the cove. I'll try suspended with it, I'll try on the bottom. I'll throw that little swim bait right down the middle of the ditch and I'll count it down. If I see shad, I see some shad schools 20, 25 feet deep, I'll cast them right down the middle and, swim into those shad schools. So those are the two primary areas that fish will live in a Clearwater lake, are ditches and points. You can't go wrong. If you do nothing but do that, you don't need any live scope. All you need is 2D sonar and you can find those areas just fine. And finally, the jig, guys. The jig's one of my favorite wintertime baits to fish because it is simple. The thing that you got to determine on jigs is the area is pretty simple. Let me talk about what you have to determine. You have to determine the size of the jig that the fish want. Sometimes the fish want a little bitty 1/8 ounce jig with a little bitty tiny craw trailer on it, and sometimes they want a bigger one. It just depends on, again, the mood and the personality of the fish. But once you do find that, again, you got to concentrate on vertical rock or steep rock. That's the whole key with the jig in the wintertime. Again, one of my favorite areas, we're back to the bluffs and the steep banks. I'll fish those main lake bluffs and the bluff ends. I'll fish the steep banks and the bluffy banks and the creeks, both creek and main lake. And those fish can be anywhere between 2 and 3 foot up on the bank down to 20, 30 foot of water, or deeper if it's really clear. But just cast that jig to the bank and just slowly hop it down the bottom into whatever the zone that you think it's going to be. That's going to be the best way to catch them. And actually, we forgot about the jerkbait. Jerkbait's the same way, guys, as far as the wintertime fishing. It's all about points and ditches. It's the same thing on the jerkbait as you're talking about with the swim bait and the A-rigs. You really have to determine the depth that the bait are at and where the fish are at. For the most part on the jerkbait, if the water clarity is under 4 feet, I'm usually putting my boat like in 10 to 15 feet of water off those main lake and secondary points, cast them to the bank, and I'm looking for those fish to be coming off the bottom in that little bit shallower water. But if the water is super clear, like over 4 or 5 foot of visibility, I may move my boat out to 25 or 30, maybe even 40 foot off those points, and I'll throw that jerkbait towards the point bank, and I may not even get close to it. I may be 30, 40 foot away from the bank when the bait hits the water, but I'm targeting those suspended fish out deeper on those point ends and sides. And the same way with the jerkbait on the ditches, except you're fishing a little bit shallow. One of the top techniques that you can catch fish on a jerkbait in the wintertime in those ditches is get back in those ditches towards the back end of those coves where that water is less than 20 foot deep. So that 10 to 20 foot zone is going to be really key on that. I remember I had just a super good day one time on Lake Hartwell in South Carolina. I was fishing all those little ditches in the back of those small coves, and I was almost to the back of the cove. My boat was in like 15 or 20 foot of water, and I just fan cast all over the back of that cove in the middle of that ditch and caught some really nice fish, especially if the wind's blowing back in there. It can be really good. If the wind's blowing back into those ditches, a lot of times it'll move those fish a little bit farther back into the ditches. But overall, guys, when you're fishing wintertime, you can't go wrong with points. There's very few lures out there except for crankbaits that you can just run points all winter long and catch fish. You just have to sort of pattern the type of point as far as the rock size on it, where it's gravel, or it's clay, the drop on it. Points are easy to pattern once you start catching a few fish on it. But fish points, as you're going to catch a lot of fish on it, and fish steep banks for the jigs and the crankbaits, and ditches. Those three things: ditches, steep banks, and points in the wintertime. About all you need to fish with those lures I talked about there is going to be really good for you. So anyway, guys, hope that helps out. It's don't let the cold weather keep you off the lake, because it's a great time to catch them. I do not like being cold. I hate being cold, but it's just a really good time to get bit, and you don't have near the many boats on the water too. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see y'all next week.